program. Okay, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. James Malazita, who's a close colleague and friend of mine from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, where I was for a lot of years before coming here in August. Jim is assistant professor in science and technology studies, as well as game design, and he's the director of the Tactical Humanities Lab at Rensselaer. Jim's work is broadly interdisciplinary, and I like to say he's one of those few folks who doesn't trade depth for breadth. His research is funded by both the National Science Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. He's published in a variety of venues spanning design, communications, digital humanities, and literary theory. Jim teaches in computer science, in game design, in product design, as well as anthropology, cultural studies, and science and technology studies. Today's talk results from ongoing work funded by one of Jim's NEH grants, and this was featured recently in the Chronicle of Higher Education, which has resulted in, I'm sorry, this is the talk from yesterday, but no money for this. This kind of stuff doesn't, no, this kind of stuff can get funded, but no, it doesn't. I'm sorry, so yesterday Jim spoke on integrating ethics and inclusion in computer science education. So the audience there is more traditional technical, but the theoretical foundations and bringing cultural studies or critical studies perspectives to technology are shared across the two venues. So in this talk, you're going to see both, as promised by the title, both literary theory and a sophisticated understanding of the technological underpinnings that shape what game designs are and can be. And so the talk today is titled, is it up there? Magical Unrealism. You're going to unpack that title for us, just so it's perfectly clear. Is that right?
Yeah.
I love the title. Literary form and software meet in Bioshock Infinite. Okay, will you help me extend a warm welcome to James Malazita?
Thanks. So thank you, Dean, and while I get my microphone set up, thank you everyone for coming, especially those of you who also came to my talk yesterday. As Dean mentioned, these are going to be very, very different. And also, as Dean was very charitable in saying that my research is both breadth and depth. I hope that's the case today, but since I'm talking about both literary theory and a critical perspective on software, I have to speak a little more broad brush than I'm generally comfortable with. But if there's any, when I'm going through the talk, if there's anything like, well, that seems a little broad or vague, can you narrow that down a bit? I'm more than happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So thank you for your patience with that. So this talk is based off an essay that just came out in an edited collection called Feminism in Play, which is about the intersection of women's studies, gender studies, and game narrative, and is also part of my hopefully forthcoming book project, which does a critical analysis of the Unreal Engine, so a software package that's used to develop games, hence magical unrealism. We'll talk about that in a bit. What I want to talk a little bit about today is in-game studies, right? Whether it's in the kind of more literary and narrative analysis of games, or in what's called the ludic or materialist analysis of games, so analyzing game mechanics or analyzing kind of the underlying software. We tend to have this split where narrative tends to be often analyzed politically, right? What types of representation exists within games, what types of characters are there, what types of messages are shown, all really great stuff. Whereas ludic, so gameplay studies, and software studies tend to be examined a little more materially. What are affordances and constraints? How do they shape the ways that designers interact with the software? But we haven't seen a lot of work that actually bridges how the underlying systems of software not only shape the types of gameplay that's possible, but actually shape the political affordances of stories, right? So how computational software can influence the types of messages that we're able to tell across different media. And so what this talk is going to be is tracing a story of Bioshock Infinite, a game that came out in 2013. Actually, how many of you have played Bioshock Infinite? Great, cool. As I get older, those hands, there's less and less hands about that every year. So tracing the history of the development of the narrative and mechanics of Bioshock Infinite, but then also how those mechanics were complicated upon the release of one of Bioshock Infinite's downloadable content, so essentially a mini-sequel called Burial at Sea, where a major non-player character becomes the playable character, and I'll trace that, and how her characterization, her politics, and her orientation to the world had to be fundamentally changed in order to make up for some of the qualities of the software. So what I'm going to trace today, again, Bioshock Infinite, and I'm going to argue that one of the major supporting characters, in fact, the major supporting character in the original game, who becomes the playable character in the downloadable content Burial at Sea, is a nice example of a modern version, a contemporary version of magical realism. And I'll talk about that as a literary form. But upon becoming a playable character, Elizabeth's magical realist or subgenre magical feminist orientations actually become undermined. And I'm going to talk about that undermining as a result of, one, just the economic and time pressures of the game development cycle, but also of some affordances and productions of meaning that the Unreal Engine has embedded into how it visualizes and how it sets up how the world works. And this is actually related to the Unreal Engine's, at various points in its development history, close tie with the US military, and how it was largely developed for, well, in part largely developed for military simulation. And so I'm going to wrap up the talk by talking about some implications of that, right? That the way the Unreal Engine encourages us, but not forces us. So I don't want to get too deterministic in this talk. I don't want to say that you can never make a feminist game or you can never make a magical realist game using game software, but that it encourages developers, especially under time constraints and monetary constraints, to craft their narratives and their characters and their gameplay experiences towards what the Unreal Engine is naturally set up to do, which tends to replicate not only militaristic ways of interacting with the world, but militaristic ways of understanding how the world works. So let's get started. So Bioshock Infinite, released in 2013, is the third game in a series of games called Bioshock that are all, the first two games are more direct sequels. This one's kind of tangential, but then gets related in later DLCs. Whereas is fairly common, especially in AAA game development, you play as the white man with the gun, Booker DeWitt. So Booker DeWitt, in a lot of ways, is your traditional masculine kind of action hero. He's gruff. He's has deeply wounded soul that he resolves by killing things. And you know, kind of throughout the game, as he navigates the world, is solving political issues. But of course, you solve political issues by cleaning up the level, and cleaning up the level means eliminating enemies. But one reason Bioshock Infinite's actually really interesting for me and for a lot of scholars is the character of Elizabeth. So in the original game, Elizabeth is not a playable character. She's more or less a sidekick. But after your initial meeting with her, where she easily falls into the damsel in distress trope, you literally rescue her from a tower. After you kind of make that initial moment of rescue, it turns out that Elizabeth has these interesting magical powers that, because of the theme of Bioshock, they're not classified as magical, they're classified as quantum, and we can talk about what that means. But Elizabeth is essentially able to open up tears in space-time. And as she progresses through the game, and she ends up kind of following but also leading your character through various points in the game, it turns out that at the very least within the game's narrative, Elizabeth is substantially more powerful and impactful on the game world than the main character, Booker DeWitt. And while the initial story of the game takes place in a floating city in the sky called Columbia that has explicitly neo-fascist and white supremacist themes, lots of exploration of racism and kind of cool but also really sad kind of replications of 19th century ideas about race and about nationality. Booker is trying to solve the problems of this society by navigating through it, by killing people, by overwhelming people, by taking out leaders. But it turns out as you go through the course of the game, the only way to undermine kind of this xenophobic, misogynistic, and racist empire is to actually reveal alternative ways the world could be. And so Elizabeth navigates the character through the world by opening these various tears in space-time, showing alternative histories, showing alternative ways of engaging with the world that eventually brings multiple characters together to overthrow the the xenophobic empire, because they've been able to see that what history is not necessarily what history needs to be. So in many ways, Elizabeth acts kind of as a magically empowered humanist or a magically empowered social scientist, right? Her agency is not through violence. Her agency is through the exploration of alternative ways of thinking, alternative worlds, and the political values embedded therein. So I tend to characterize this, and there's actually a lot of debate over this, which I'm very happy to have, as Elizabeth falling within a tradition of literary form called magical realism. Magical realism is kind of a broad, intense, sometimes hard to define genre. The form that I'm using is most closely associated with Latin American decolonial literature, especially as highlighted by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Isabel Allende, and then depending on who you talk to, Jorge Luis Borges. Sometimes he's postmodern, sometimes he's magical realist. Interesting thing. Where the formation of the narratives is that of two competing epistemological and ontological worlds, right? So not only do you have multiple characters interacting with one another, tending to be often colonizers and the colonized, right? These interactions are not just about violence and power, they're about exploring how the world for colonized and oppressed peoples literally operates differently than the world for colonizers, right? And often this is framed later as a form of epistemicide, right? That when a group comes in and colonizes another group, it's not just about taking material resources. It's not just about taking over land. It's actually about saying your way of thinking about how the world works is not correct and must be destroyed. And so magical realism constantly juxtaposes competing ways of imagining how the world works. So it's very, very common in a magical realist text for dead characters to reappear, sometimes as ancestors, sometimes as living again, then disappear, and no one makes a comment about it, right? It's not like a high fantasy novel where people are like, oh, the veil is torn. It's like, no, of course ancestors can speak to us, right? And depending on who the character is in the story, they can experience these worlds in different ways. And Salman Rushdie describes magical realism as stories that capture that impossible events happen constantly and quite plausibly out in the open under the midday sun, right? That the ways that we construct systems and rationalistic systems of understanding the world are constantly undermined, not only by our own interactions in the world, but as soon as we start getting cross-cultural understandings of the world. And so Stephen Sleman describes magical realism as a battle between two oppositional systems, so two ways of thinking about the world that are actually incommensurable, each working towards the creation of a different kind of fictional world from the other. Since the ground rules of these two worlds are incompatible, neither one can fully come into being, and each remains suspended, locked in a continuous disjunction, right? So the interesting and the tension and kind of the decolonial political work that magical realist texts do is not only the highlighting of major characters being colonized characters, characters of color, and women characters, but also that the world itself, the way the reader experiences events in the world, create an unresolvable tension. Wilson describes that reading a magical realist text requires for the reader a faculty for boundary skipping between worlds, right? If you're reading a magical realist text and feel settled, that's not the point of the magical realist text, right? It's always to create a feeling of unsettledness within the reader. And so Elizabeth, for me, is, through her investigations, through her creations of alternative realities that are kind of explored, but we never really talk about the nature of the quantum realm that she inhabits. There's a couple of other characters who also have quantum powers, but they don't really go to a rational way of describing it. operates in this way as saying the only way to actually deal with these xenophobic games of empire is by creating alternative and oppositional worlds that create these ruptures, that create these opportunities for political and material intervention. And because of her kind of specific characterization of the empowered in magical feminism, which is a subvariant of magical realism, kind of the empowered witch character, which I mean in the best way possible, right? A superpowered woman whose goal is to take down embedded patriarchy, right? So all the best ways witches can be. Elizabeth also embodies this kind of magical feminist narrative that we see, especially out of the work of Isabel Allende. So this is all great, and I don't want to pretend that Bioshock Infinite, it's still a AAA game. It's written and directed by Ken Levine, who's a auteur figure, but still a white dude. So I don't want to pretend this is like a super activist, super critical game. But there's certainly elements here of wanting to engage with decolonial and feminist logics, even within the context of a pretty mainstream title. So great. A year after Bioshock Infinite gets released, 2 DLCs, downloadable contents, essentially mini sequels that require the original game to be installed and are kind of just attached onto it, are released. Burial at Sea 1 and Burial at Sea 2. In the second part of Burial at Sea, the player is able to control Elizabeth. So rather than Elizabeth being a non-player character that the player can interact with, Elizabeth actually becomes the player, or the player becomes Elizabeth. This is Elizabeth in Burial at Sea 2. And you might notice some differences, one being a gun, right? So in Burial at Sea 2, for various and kind of poorly written reasons, at the very, very beginning of this kind of 8-hour-long downloadable content, all of Elizabeth's powers are stripped from her. Right? It actually doesn't really get explained, but suddenly she's not able to boundary skip between worlds. She's not able to open tear. She's not even really able to access, within the original game, she was able to like pull a machine gun out of another dimension for Booker to use, right? So there's already some complication of magical feminism there. But all of these abilities are just gone. Elizabeth now has to sneak around the world because all the enemies that she encounters are men and therefore much stronger than her. Elizabeth doesn't really have access to guns. She has access to a crossbow that she can use to knock characters out, and she has to fearfully navigate the world in order to kind of complete levels. If you try to play Elizabeth as you would play Booker, encountering a person, shooting that person, moving on, you will fail. Because the game is designed to say Elizabeth is a different kind of character. She is not strong. Violence is not her forte. She has to be very fearful of these enemies and just kind of sneak around them at the very end. Right? And I found this fascinating because this is a complete undermining of everything that Elizabeth represented in the original game. Right? Not only in terms of violence isn't the answer, actually the exploration of alternative worlds is the answer, but also Elizabeth as a character of strength is now portrayed as her primary quality is one of weakness, right? One of needing to hide. And it's interesting because we can start to see some of these tensions around the character of Elizabeth with developer interviews that were happening as the DLC was being created. So this is all quotes from different interviews with Amanda Jeffrey, who is the lead level designer for Burial at Sea 2. And she talks about, there's actually a lot more really interesting stuff, about needing to keep true to the character of Elizabeth as they're developing the game. And she says, there's all these thoughtful ways of different ways of being more thoughtful, and I hesitate to say it, creating more feminine ways of approaching a problem, right? So when the player is playing as Elizabeth, the player must be more feminine, and there's ways we can design that. And then one of my favorite quotes, if we were to just put Booker in a dress, that would be the most awful betrayal of what we're doing for Liz. Right? So again, even the developers here are thinking about, this is a substantially different character with a substantially different orientation to the world, and we need the game to reflect that. But then we start seeing these tensions. Well, at the same time, some things for the player Elizabeth character will have to be the same. We don't have time to make an entirely new game. We're always building on an existing set of systems and all the rest of it, right? So again, there's this tension between what they want for the character, what the game engine is already running on, so the Unreal Engine, as well as some of the systems that were built customized for the original Bioshock game, which the DLC needs to be scaffolded on top of. And so what I argue is that because of the systems that were designed and because of the underlying logics of the Unreal Engine, which was used to develop Bioshock, as soon as we stop observing Elizabeth, right, and I call it later a kind of voyeuristic observation, right? As soon as we stop kind of, oh, it's interesting, look what the other can do in all their magical ways, and actually have to embody the other character, suddenly the gaps in what game engine software can do are revealed, in that we actually can't take decolonial stances as a player character in real time, right? So why is that? So Bioshock Infinite was developed using the Unreal Engine, hence magical unrealism. There's my unpacking. Thank you, Dean. Which is a pretty common industry standard development toolkit. Specifically, this one was developed using the Unreal Engine 3. Now they're up to Unreal Engine 4. And what I'm going to argue using Kate Crawford's piece, Can an Algorithm Be Agonistic, is that software makes arguments about the world. Right? Software is not just a set of tools that we can kind of deploy however we want. Software has us embody the way that the software operates, right? Like if we encounter the Unreal Engine and we say, you know what, I don't think Boolean-based logic is useful. I want to create a different type of thinking system. Your computer, it's going to be divide by zero. Your computer's going to crash, right? So we actually have to internalize the logics of the systems that we're using to develop narratives, even as we're trying to subvert some of those systems' logics, right? So the game engine makes arguments that contribute to the larger body of narrative. So the Unreal Engine is kind of interesting in that it's, if any of you have ever read any science technology studies literature, the Unreal Engine is literally an actor network. All objects in the game are discrete actors, so individual, very bounded components with a set of properties. If you've ever done any object-oriented programming before, this becomes the groundwork in which the Unreal Engine operates. So in order for any objects including characters, including sets, including levels, including events. So an explosion is an object. A cutscene is an object. All of these things must be very clearly defined within a hierarchical system, right? So the base is an actor. A pawn is a subtype of actor. A character is a subtype of pawn, which is a subtype of actor, which also has really interesting political ramifications there, that people are just pawns. But every single object developed in the Unreal Engine must be very, very clearly defined and delineated, not only in terms of its own properties, I'll skip around, but also, and I'll get to this in a second, in terms of each object's relation to other objects within the system, right? So every object is a nested system of nested hierarchies of other objects. If you try to non-define an object or make an object undefined or underdefined, the Unreal Engine can't handle that type of work, right? It can't leave an object undefined. Objects need very particular sets of properties in order to be operationalizable within the world. This, I'm going to argue, is somewhat related to the types of logics that we use and that come out of the military entertainment complex, as Tim Lenoir calls it. So the military entertainment complex, different than the military industrial complex, is this argument that military games and simulation, as well as the software that underpins them, participate in this larger, specifically United States, but more Western global than that, understanding that military logics, which kind of derive from high-level game theory economic logics, are the ways in which we can approach the world and are the appropriate ways of simulating how the world works. And often, like, there's actually a lot of games that simulate the military, but also critique the military. So it's not necessarily that all games that involve running around shooting people are pro-military, but they all highlight this sort of rationalistic, point-based, combat-oriented way of navigating the world, right? That this is an appropriate and legitimate way of navigating the world. When the Unreal Engine was first developed, and for those of you who haven't worked with game engine software before, the vast, vast, vast majority of games developed are developed using some sort of base engine software. Very few games are coded from the ground up, especially AAA games, because they're so complex, right? Simulating physics is a huge mathematical process, to say nothing of translating those simulations to your processors so that your game can actually run correctly. So the vast majority of games are developed using these engines as a tool. When the Unreal Engine was first developed, in 1991, it was for a game called Unreal, hence Unreal Engine, which was a multi-person, first-person shooter game, actually one of the most important games in founding that genre of 3D kind of interpersonal combat. And it was essentially designed for Tim Sweeney, so the major developer of the game, to be able to create new levels somewhat on the fly. And then over time, kind of being jealous of the fact that Doom was released open source and you could actually kind of use Doom engines to recreate new Doom levels, the original Unreal Engine editor was released to the internet, so Netscape back in the day, and players were able to use the engine to create new characters and new levels for Unreal. So we start seeing in the early 90s this transition from the engines as just base sets for individual games to actually being more broad and generalizable authorship toolkits. Tim Sweeney is now, I think, I'd have to look this up, but one of the top 30 richest men in the United States right now. I think he has a net worth of something like $8 billion. Founded Epic Games Software, which largely makes its money by licensing the Unreal Engine to various different properties, as well as using the Unreal Engine to create its own games, which then feed functionality back into the Unreal Engine. If you've ever played Fortnite, Fortnite is developed using the Unreal Engine, and basically every hack that the developers create to make a new functionality in Fortnite becomes a base functionality in Unreal. So there's this really interesting relationship between the narratives that are created using Unreal and then the functionality of Unreal itself, especially for in-house developed games. But one of the first major successes for the Unreal Engine as broader commercial development software was the second version of the engine, Unreal Engine 2, which was packaged alongside a game called America's Army in 2002. And for those of you who haven't played it, America's Army is a first-person shooting game co-sponsored and co-developed with the US military that's designed as both a recruitment tool, but also a training tool. And there's a lot of really interesting things in it. One, it kind of very, very consciously critiques players for traditional first-person shooting like tropes. So for example, and if you've ever played first-person shooters before, one of the best things you can do is hold a gun, run, and strafe, and just fire at random, right? The US military does not condone that type of firing, right? So if you ever played America's Army, it actually, if you try to strafe, run, and shoot, you lose points. You're supposed to stand, set, aim, fire, move on to the next thing, right? America's Army also introduces ideological components, right? So whereas in a traditional first-person shooter game, you kind of just run around, kill a bunch of people, survive as long as you can, America's Army says, well, there's honor points. If you leave a teammate behind, you will lose game points. If you decide to friendly fire is always enabled, so you can accidentally or on purpose shoot your teammates. Whereas in a lot of games, it just results in a loss of social capital. People think you're a jerk. In America's Army, friendly fire is incredibly punished because you're being sloppy. America's Army also has one of Unreal's first major online components where players can play alongside actual US active military members. And active military members are marked with a special like star next to their name in online play. So players are able to mimic what real military people do and therefore learn to interact with them, gain interpersonal connections with them. And it's been an incredibly successful recruitment tool. And then during it's not widespread, but in some like boot camp and training settings, actual US military members have been trained using this or modified versions of America's Army as a simulation tool. So America's Army and Unreal Engine 2 are co-released. Many game developers, especially in the early 2000s, there's like not a lot of game development majors. You're either coming from computer science, or what a lot of people did is you develop your own portfolio on your own, mostly by hacking together your own games. So many of the aspiring game developers who are now senior developers in 2019 kind of worked their chops by modifying America's Army. So developing these more kind of militaristic simulations to learn what game design was, to learn what appropriate level design was, all of which were influenced by US military techniques. And it's actually incredibly common now if you have the job of a level designer, so basically not only the person who creates the 3D model of a space, but also determines the player interactions with that space, what counts as cover, what counts as the thing you can jump over, to actually be trained by US military members to determine what's real cover, what would be reasonable to do in an actual military simulation, and then of course these things are always pumped up for entertainment value. So the Unreal Engine has a deep connection with kind of these military logics, right? Not only in terms of developing military games, but in this idea of broad look, assessment, and breakdown, right? What Deleuze and Guattari have called territorialization, right? That an open space, an undefined space, must be rationally territorialized. We must make sense of it by breaking it into discrete, objective, interrelated parts. And that once we have successfully territorialized this space by breaking it down into these discrete components, now we know how to rationally intervene within that space and interact within that space. You can see why this would make a lot of sense, especially for mass military operations, right? We want to define what counts as a legitimate target and what doesn't. What counts as a space that can be interacted in, what doesn't. What counts as civilian space and what counts as military space. Are individuals within those spaces marked as targets or innocents, right? So again, we see this territorialization. Everyone must be clearly marked with a specific set of properties, all of whom are related to one another. Exactly what the Unreal Engine has you do as you're developing levels. This also, I can say, we can see the success of the Unreal Engine. These are a handful of the non-entertainment companies who since 2014 have licensed the Unreal Engine for simulation work. So we see Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin. We see the US Defense Intelligence Agency, Department of Homeland Security, NASA. The Michigan Department of Transportation used the Unreal Engine to simulate a new subway system or a new tram system that they want to create in Detroit, right? So we see these kind of rationalization, creation of territory logics applied to many, many, many non-entertainment-based spaces. And the Unreal Engine now has been self-consciously working to get more into civil engineering and architectural spaces as well, right? So we see these application of logics outside of the entertainment space. But this system of discrete concretization, of figuring out how the world works, defining it appropriately and exactly and continuously, is directly at odds with magical realism, right? Magical realism, things are by nature undefined, or at the very least defined one way and then radically defined a different way the next scene with no explanation and no process, right? This is the point, that there's always a continuous tension among how different characters view the world. So when you try to play as a magical and realist character, when the computer actually needs to simulate in real time how these systems are working, we see how these tensions can arise, right? The system needs clear definition. Magical realism, by its definition, resists clear definition. It's also an interesting way to think about the properties of the book as a media format. Right? Within a literary text format, you can privilege and deprivilege the author's or the reader's senses, right? You can describe something in terms of smell. Then the next thing you can describe it in terms of sight. You never have to give a full definition of a scene because those scenes can always be interpreted and completed by the reader. You don't have that luxury when you need to do physics simulations. Everything must be very clearly and universally defined. So kind of to wrap this up, what I'm arguing here is that when you have pre-scripted events, right? So within the context of the story, Elizabeth is opening radically different alternative histories, alternative spaces. Within the context of code, all of this stuff is pre-written. There's nothing radical or alternative about it. There's a very specific sequence of new objects that gets created that the player interacts with and then disappears. Right? So for the player, it seems as though Elizabeth is creating these on-the-fly random new worlds. From a code base, it's actually very, very simple. You create a new world object, you let the player see it, you close that object, and you move on. Right? So we can script and simulate the non-Western other, right? Other ways of understanding how the world works. But once we have to embody that non-Western other, as soon as we have to say the way in which you play, by definition, must be undefined, we quickly butt up against the ideological consequences of these systems, right? These systems are not designed to do this. There's also longer histories of the fact that these systems are built upon computers, which need Boolean logics and very specific logic gates in order to work on. So I don't want to blame Unreal just for this, right? There's a longer history of how these politics are built into all the technologies that we're using. And so it's possible to kind of observe, and I use the word voyeuristically observe, kind of self-consciously, as this, it's not just observing the other, it's kind of taking pleasure in the idea that their experience is not mine, and yet I actually don't have to worry about feeling their experience. I can just view it as other. But as soon as we need to embody other types of cultures, other types of ways of understanding how the world is framed, the engine fails. And so for me, this talk is really, as it's a part of a broader project, is about opening up possibilities of humanities and technical inquiry into how we think about and analyze digital media like games, as well as the interrelations of narrative, politics, and the software that games are built on. So one, an opening up of asking questions about the political and narrative dimensions of software, right? So that software is not just a base set of tools or a base platform, but is actually an active participant in how stories and how characters and how politics get shaped. And that we need, as humanists, as social scientists, to develop techniques and analytic tools that are able to see the intersections of the underlying design tools with the narratives they created. And along with this, the need to, we're really good, especially in the humanities and literary sciences, literary studies, of talking about the need for counter-representation, the need for developing different kinds of narratives that represent characters in better ways. All of this is great. But also that we need to attend to developing systems, especially technological systems for digital narratives, that help us tell these stories. Because right now, while we can tell these stories, there's a really great game, Life is Strange, which takes a magical realist approach. Kentucky Route Zero came out a couple years ago, if you ever played that, kind of explicitly a magical realist approach. But a lot of the work in developing those games was in hacking and undermining the system of Unreal, right? So really kind of tearing apart the engine and putting it back together. And so what would it mean to have a software engine that by default embraces these different types of ways of understanding and mapping out the world, so it's easier to create alternative forms of storytelling? So that's kind of my talk. Thank you so much for attending. I'm happy to have any Q&A. Thank you.
We're good until 10 to 1, so have at it.
Yeah.
Really fascinating talk. I really like this. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the concept of territorialization. So it sounds like you're talking about breaking the space down into discrete regions that each sort of maybe have their own people or their own character. Mm-hmm. But it seems like if you're going to be creating a game in which people are entering some space for maybe 1 hour, and you want them to form a memorable experience of it in an hour, they're not spending a year in it. You need to make it, as unique with respect to other areas as possible, the same way that you make a character unique with respect to other characters. And so is this just something that, is this unavoidable in any sort of game that people are playing with for a limited period of time?
Great, thank you. So again, breadth and depth, right? So the logic of territorialization, right? One of the ways that manifests is through this very particular, like literal geographic mapping and then hierarchical development of space. In the broader sense, when Deleuze talks about it, territorialization really means coming into an undefined space, that could mean cultural space, right? It doesn't have to be physical space, and applying a certain type of mapping logic onto it that undermines or countervails other types of logics, right? So I need to make this space understandable by me. If anyone else wants to interact with the space that I've created, culture, like we can talk about the university as a territorialized space, right? It has very specific rules and ways of interacting that if you want to undermine, you get kicked out, often. And so there's a couple components to that. So one could be how do we develop systems that offer, especially for three-dimensional games, right? Three-dimensional vision in the West is very, very associated with kind of Euclidean geometry. That's actually very different from three-dimensional vision in other cultures. There's a really cool I'll have to find them. There's an art collective in Japan. I think they actually have the word Unreal in their collective that talks about traditional Japanese art as having a fundamentally different understanding of space and how to use three-dimensional software to create Eastern understandings of art of 3 dimensions rather than Western understandings of 3 dimensions. So it could be that, right? So actually thinking of a different way of scoping out how space works. But it can also be a thing of what we assume narratives look like and experiences look like are also territorialized, right? So there's been a really, really cool development in game narrative design recently that counters the understanding of a game as something that you sit down and are kind of immersed in for an hour and then break, and that actually games, you don't have control over the time that games happen. So I forget the game, but it's basically a text message simulator, and it tries to simulate actual texting practices, including if I text someone back in 30 minutes, the game might not respond to me for 5 hours. And the way in which the game responds to me responds to how I'm interacting with a different character. They might ghost me at some point. I actually don't have control over the flow of the narrative, right? So not only deterritorializing how space and vision works, but what does it mean to create a consumable narrative? Yeah. I hope that helps or gets at some of it. Great. Yeah?
So you said that a lot of these games, they work off like a militaristic view of the world. What would be like an alternative way to go about these games?
Right. So it's really, really hard to think about. One of my favorite ones I actually would not know how to put into a digital format, but one that I love telling is Dungeons and Dragons. Right? For me, Dungeons and Dragons is in many ways inherently non-rational, non-militaristic. And in fact, it's really funny because how many of you played D&D, by the way? Nice, this is awesome. So if you've ever played like the different versions of Dungeons and Dragons, you'll notice that the ongoing tension is always, well, how much is clearly defined by the rules and how much is left open to the player? And every version of D&D, you can see that one development team won out over the other in these conversations, right? So D&D 3 or Pathfinder is like everything is a rule, everything is a dice set, everything is an individual numerical property, right? So very rationalistic systems. D&D 2nd edition is like, I don't know, you cast a fire spell, decide what happens, right? So D&D is imagined as collective storytelling, as rules actually being created and fluid on the fly. For me, as an alternative example to something like D&D 3.5, where you actually have very little space. You can create narratives, but the game system itself directs how those narratives must unfold. Now, what would that mean to translate that into a digital space where you're necessarily building on top of defined narratives? I don't know. Not even sure right now if we can do that, right? So what would that look like, assuming building a digital game engine that privileges collective storytelling over spatial rhetoric and logic? Yeah. Dean?
Okay, I want to follow up on this one because you earlier juxtaposed the traditional text to the game.
Yep.
And if you're privileging the physics inside the game, that leads to one set of associations and expectations. But you could equally privilege the text within the game.
Mm-hmm.
So can you intersect textual logics and freedoms within the game, and then sort of how does that play out in practice? Because sort of my introduction to this space was you make a choice, I mean early 80s,
yeah. You
make a choice and you get a textual narrative,
yep.
and you make another choice and you get another textual narrative. So talk about the opportunity space there.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of experimentation in game space with this kind of like choose your own adventure narrative, as well as pushing those boundaries. I mean, we can talk about like Bandersnatch, right? Which is doing a very, very old thing, but it's on Netflix, so it counts as new now. So yeah, this kind of remediation of text, and very specifically like written literary text. Right now, games tend to remediate cinema, including things like, well, you know that you've moved between scenes because there's a fade to black and then a fade in, right? So the language of cinema is how we assume people know how to navigate between spaces. So there are examples of this, and before they shuttered, Telltale Games was a really, really nice way of thinking visually about how to explore linear but branching narrative text. They created a really cool set of games, one of which was a narrative version of The Walking Dead, like the zombie show. But interestingly, there's another component there where members of the gaming community said, well, those don't actually count as games, they're interactive narratives. right? So there's this other social dimension that as soon as you start undermining what people expect from their interactions with games, suddenly they're not games anymore. Even though they're developed using the same game engine software, they use the same platforms of like, they are released on iPad and PlayStation 3, right? So they're still on game engine equipment. But because the ways of interacting with the space are suddenly different, they no longer count, for some people, as what it means to be defined as a game. Yeah?
So you've talked a lot about the emphasis on territories and kind of applying to the user's desires with the experiences, but in the modern day, right now with the success in these battle royale games and stuff, how do you think that lack of narrative or lore really comes into play in these games?
Yeah, so games like Fortnite are really, really great examples of alternative methods of storytelling, right? So kind of even when Bioshock Infinite was written, not that long ago, 6 years, the major way of engaging with the world is you're given like a narrative cutscene, and then you play a level. Sometimes active events happen, and then you break back out of that level. You don't really have that in Fortnite, right? You get dropped off by a plane, but that's kind of the end of it. And yet, Fortnite has a huge set of lore around it, right? Why the players are there. There's like new episodes, even though you don't really narratively experience them, new characters that fade in and fade out of existence as new updates get released. So for me, that's actually a really interesting new form of storytelling where product updates and patches create new types of worlds for players to engage in, right? So you don't actually need to tell a straight linear story. The story can be something that you kind of implicitly piece together. I forget the company, but the company that makes Dark Souls and Bloodborne is also really, really good at this, right? You experience the story by, if you navigate 3 menus deep and read a description of an item, and you read enough descriptions of items, you kind of get a sense of the world. So yeah, it's this interesting idea of stories not as nonlinear or linear, but actually as environmental. And in some cases, almost completely detached from the experience of the game, and yet contributing to a larger understanding of the game as you play through them.
Well, so what I was kind of meaning more like the newer, more successful game of 2019 in Apex Legends, which really has little to zero lore or narrative to it. How do you feel that users still get that same experience though?
So I'm reminded of, part of it is just what's called the ludic experience. Like you create, I don't want to write it on a whiteboard. There's a really cool concept called a ludonarrative, which is this idea that the narrative is not just the elements that you get from the game, but the narrative becomes the player experience of the game, right? And we can see ludonarrative in kind of standard linear games as well. So like my experience of Final Fantasy VII, for example, and this dates me, is constantly dying and having to reload at this one boss over and over and over again. And so my experience of that game, my ludonarrative of the game, says that that boss is way more powerful than any of the end game bosses, despite the fact that in terms of the game, that's not true. So many players, the way games work, create narratives that aren't necessarily like projecting characterizations, but you create a narrative about your own experiences with the game and how you interact with it. And this is actually a really kind of classic way that games operate of like, what's the narrative of Pac-Man? Right? Like the narrative is your experience of going to the arcade, of playing it, of navigating levels, right? There's a character, but same with like asteroids, missile commands, there might be at best a wrapper, but the narrative experience that people create is the ludonarrative experience. So in a lot of ways, it's actually going back to that like very, very classic experience of what it means to design a narrative. Yeah.
So then for certain games, so like for example, Overwatch, how it's another game where you get dropped in, you play.
Yep.
However, the company made their like background videos that somebody is able to go view. What is kind of your connection there, like with view, like story that is outside of the game completely versus what you're actually playing in the game?
Yeah, Henry Jenkins has a bunch of really good writing about this transmedia storytelling, where the idea is you actually don't get the full version of the game, which is kind of a problematic claim. But unless you play the game and watch the movie and download the extra downloadable content, and back when he wrote in like 2004, he wrote about like the Matrix a lot. And also unless you participate in online message boards, right? And so if any of you remember like when The Matrix and its sequels came out and the whole like video game ecosystem around it, all of those movies and games have like massive gaps in the story that are, I mean, frankly, they're just bad writing. But the producers of this media ecosystem said, no, they're not bad writing. You just haven't experienced enough of the world. And if you were a real fan, you would go onto the message boards, right? And so there's this interesting thing of not only the story gets told across multiple formats of media that aren't necessarily connected together, but also there's a hierarchy of fandom, right? Like the people who know more about the story are the people who are more committed to it, right? Which is, again, a weird power move. But yeah, anything about transmedia storytelling, that's becoming more and more popular now, not so much the message boards, but the idea that these are always multimodal experiences. Yep.
So I'll leave this very vague for you to go where you want, but like, what do you think the larger role of video games will be, right? We hear people saying violent video games have bad impacts on children, and you've got generations that are growing up with games as part of their lives, as opposed to people playing them later. Like, what do you think that role will be going forward?
Right, so this is always an interesting question as someone who's in a games department who wants to talk about the fact that games are cultural objects and therefore not only represent our culture, but also feed back into it, but who also doesn't want to make the claim that playing violent video games makes you shoot things, right? And that's like, and yet there's a very deep and rich middle ground between, like, the two positions tend to be games are great and don't affect anything and you'll kill people. So there was, I wish I could remember, there's one really interesting study out of psychology that's not my domain at all, so I'm not sure how legit it is, that said, for example, violent video games don't increase violence or aggression. What they do is encourage the people who play them to approach social situations more competitively, right? And that's not necessarily in an aggressive manner, but assuming that when I'm in a social situation, there is a hierarchy there, and it's implicitly better to be farther up on that hierarchy than farther down, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's an interesting result of like, oh, we're actually training how people visualize social space, right? And that's like one very, very small example. But for me, who studies games as cultural artifacts, it's more about how games are training us to think about the world and how it works, less than like, I'm going to mimic something I saw in a game, or this game narrative was bad and therefore I do bad things, right? So really experiencing how the experience of being trained and thinking through games shapes broader systems. And we see already some trickle down effect of this, of like the gamification of universities, right? Like, well, what universities are is we can offer badges instead of credits. And then if you collect enough badges, eventually you'll get a degree. It's like, that's a interesting way of thinking about knowledge and skills as a discrete thing that you can pin on and then you're good, right? Like, but again, we can totally see, like, that's a very typical video game framing of what knowledge looks like. Yeah?
So I'm interested in the transition that you mentioned of Elizabeth from the damsel in distress trope as she's introduced to like a more powerful figure. Do you think that was a choice that the writers made, conscious of their target audience, like maybe the stereotypical gamer would not, like, to make the character, to make a strong female, three-dimensional female character more palatable to a demographic that might not be receptive to it?
That's interesting. I kind of hope so. I almost want to give them that credit. I'm also not sure how much of it is just bad writing. So there's a lot of, I see that particular interaction as one, a narrative trope of, I'm sorry, I'm going to give some spoilers. It turns out through quantum magic that the main character, Booker, is actually Elizabeth's father, right? And there's these weird dimension hopping things. And so one, I can see it being used as a narrative trope of, well, we want to establish fatherly connection without revealing the fact that he's their father, and fathers protect daughters. So of course the first thing they're going to do is rescue them from a tower, right? So there is that possible, like, very literary allusion there. It's also possible that when you're introducing a player to a game, like the beginning levels, even if they're not explicitly tutorial, act as a tutorial. And so the developers needed a way to allow the player to experience the world as Booker without needing to worry about Elizabeth, because that adds an additional layer of complication to the game. And so we need to keep Elizabeth away, but also create an emotional connection of the player for wanting to keep Elizabeth there. So we'll just have the player rescue Elizabeth. And I'm not sure why they literally chose a tower. So yeah, there's a couple ways of thinking through, and it could be a combination of the two, right? While we're creating this literary illusion, also it gets Elizabeth out of the way until we need to deploy her. Yeah.
kind of ask you a question that puts the awesome talk you gave today in dialogue with some of your other work and invites you to kind of expand there. There's something to expand through. I noticed you're involved in some tactical work.
Yes.
Center for Tactical
Humanities. Yep.
So I'm thinking about the ways that the way that I as a scholar encounter tactics and strategies, which is largely through the work of like Michel Foucault, in which tactics mean a certain thing with respect to power, with respect to the ability to make kind of claims about territory and space, and to set rules, or to make little changes to navigate rules that somebody else has set. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about where you see sort of exciting interventions into gaming multiplicity happening with respect to these kinds of power moves in space, in industry. And if that's something you think about a lot as somebody who's alive with a tactical organization.
Great, yeah, thank you. While I'm thinking about how to answer that, I'll give some context for the audience about strategy and tactics. So this idea of Michel Desserteau writes this really awesome book, Walking the City, or is that a chapter in the book? I think it's the whole book. Anyway, so traditionally when we talk about strategy and tactics, they're hierarchical, right? Strategy is, this is how I plan out the entire, often war, right? They're kind of explicitly militaristic things. And then tactics are what I do individually at the level of the battlefield that contribute up back to the larger war. What Desserteau does is he says, actually, strategy and tactics are opposites. So strategy is a particular point of view, right? And it becomes this larger discussion about that there is no objective or universal view, right? Every view is a view from somewhere, right? Because we're all individual people and have specific cultures. That the idea of I can map out entire vast spaces and see how they work and actually plan and direct those spaces is a view of the powerful. Literally in the case that he's talking about, people at the top of a skyscraper looking down into a city. So that things tend to be managed strategically, but that on the ground, people interact with these large spaces tactically. And so the individual on the ground experiences of things like cities are actually, in a lot of ways, resisting larger strategic movements. And he talks about desire lines. So if you've ever seen like a sidewalk and there's a green space like grass, and you could either take a 90-degree turn or you can just walk straight through the grass and a new path gets worn. That's called a desire line. For Desserteau, that's a tactic, right? People are actually navigating that space in a way that was not intended, but in a way that totally makes sense when you're on the ground. But when you're above the ground, you're like, of course, it's a grid and people will navigate through the grid, right? So strategies versus tactics. And so the Tactical Humanities Lab is, I just steal it from Desserteau, right? But this idea of, so I'm at RPI, another tech institution very much like mine's, in the School of Haas, which, we're great, but we're a humanities school inside of a larger engineering school. And yet, resisting against the idea that humanities researchers at engineering schools are by definition the opposite of the rest of the school culture, right? So thinking about how can we actually engage with technocratic, scientifically oriented, in many ways, even things like this idea of we territorialize and create new discrete objects. How can we engage and intervene and in some ways subvert that without taking a kind of a counter-strategic position of your way is bad, my way is better, I'm going to do it my way without you, but actually operate within those spaces. And so some of the work that I've been doing in the Tactical Humanities Lab is actually subverting what it means to be a lab. So in a lot of cases in engineering schools, labs there's the PI, right? And then I have like my undergrad and grad student underlings who like work through my project, right? The way we frame the THL is, Tactical Humanities Lab, THL, is that students actually come to the lab with their own projects, and the only qualifications that they need is that the projects have to be engaged in digital space somehow, and they have to be engaged in social justice. But aside from that, we broadly kind of accept what they're doing. So right now we have one student hacking guitar pedals to talk about how we can actually change patterns of electricity to encourage different types of thinking. And we have another student deconstructing DNA testing kits about how they assume DNA works, right? So radically different things, both of which you're engaging with, like our dean of the School of Science is like, oh, so humanities students are working with DNA and electronics? That sounds like something we can fund. And I'm like, yes, and also we're doing it in order to explore alternative epistemologies, but yes, please fund us, right? So again, this like, how can we work within these systems, acknowledging that we're always going to be embedded in these systems, while also kind of working through them to accomplish other types of goals. So that's the way the THL right now is set up. We've also only been doing it for a year, so we're still kind of figuring it out. Yeah.
Kind of going backwards to a more technical question.
Yeah.
But you were talking a lot about how the Unreal Engine had this retention ability, so to speak, of the features that are added to
Yes.
other engines. But I was thinking about, I don't know if you're familiar with the reboot of God of War that happened last year, and how pretty much they had to create a whole new engine. So what kind of the benefits and the drawbacks are of this retention ability of the older engines kind of building on top of each other versus making a new one, which for God of War resulted in them winning Game of the Year?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because especially when you're at like the student and indie games level, you're basically stuck with what Epic Games gives you, right? And they actually do a lot of they're pretty good at customer outreach and helping you hack the system. Once you're at the AAA level, very, very, very few games use the vanilla version of any engine, right? A lot of proprietary redevelopment, the development of new types of tools and new types of plugins. Epic is just in the privileged position of their proprietary stuff can just become the main engine, right? So it's not so much that the Unreal Engine is special in that it lets you do that. It's that Epic owns Unreal and Fortnite, so what they make for Fortnite, they put back into Unreal. So it's pretty common to develop customization experiences. So then, this is kind of a super geeky thing that I've been talking about in my in the book that I'm writing, but we still see traces of these past uses and proprietary systems of engines kind of carried through. So in Unreal specifically, the camera's real funky. And there's no specific player character object within the world. There's a bunch of characters, and you make an action called possessing, and you possess the character, and the camera gets behind the character, and that's who you play as. In the vast majority of engines, when you possess a character, the camera kind of pans over but keeps the same general camera angle that you create, because that sudden whipping around of I'm going to reorient to that character's eye is really queasy, especially when you're working in VR. Unreal is one of the only game engines that by default does that whip, where if I'm here at a character and the character is looking this way, if I possess that character, I immediately snap. And the reason they do that is because when they built the Unreal Engine's algorithms for camera swapping, they built it assuming that whenever you swapped characters, it's because you were on foot getting into a tank. And therefore, what you need to do is align your camera with the barrel of the tank gun. So again, now, even outside of military equipment and hopping in and out of vehicles, there's still this kind of really fun artifact from 20 years ago about how the developers assumed camera switching was going to be used. That's now built in as kind of the common navigation system of Unreal, right? So again, does that have massive implications? Probably not. But it's really interesting seeing how we can actually unearth these different micro artifacts within these larger systems because of how they're always kind of piecemeally fit together.
Jim, I want to take moderator's prerogative and ask the final question. So in your argument, or in your talk, you use the language, game engines make arguments.
Yes.
You don't say something like, the game engine has inherent limitations to which the designer must respond or must be accommodated. Just to sort of underline the point, why is it an argument?
Right. How much time do I have? Okay. So for me, positioning, so it's two ways of talking about it, right? So positioning it as the game engine is something that the developer must respond to. For me, positions the game engine as a neutral thing that has affordances and constraints, right? You have to react to it, but at the end of the day, you kind of just learn how it works and then make little hacks, right? What I'm arguing is that while you do have to learn how the game engine works, you actually reshape as you're in development, right? Because games are not scripted and developed in one go, and then you just translate that script into an engine. You work on it over time, things change. That the game engine actually exerts a kind of agency in the way that you think about developing games, right? So the game action, for me, is making narrative arguments as you develop. So with Bioshock Infinite, for example, when they originally designed the character of Elizabeth, she was supposed to be a very active participant in the player's world. So like you would walk around, she would interact with things in a very lively and real way, and you would explore the story together. Unreal couldn't do it. I mean, it could, but it took a lot of processing power and ran out of time. And so they just said, you know what, Elizabeth's just going to hide in a corner while you shoot things, and every once in a while she'll pass you health packs, right? And then that construction of Elizabeth hides while Booker shoots becomes recreated into the story. So it's not just I can do this and I can't do this and I have to plan ahead. It's actually that we're working with and through the game engine within our own constructions of narrative and our own constructions of how these characters are interacting with the world. So that's why I call it an argument.
Let's thank
Great. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks everyone for coming. If you want to talk to Jim, he has some time this afternoon and possibly tomorrow. If you want to talk to him